It's been 30 years, more than 30 years, that the United Nations Resolution 33426 was actually adopted by the General Assembly at the United Nations in New York. A UFO resolution that sounds kind of funny to people who only know UFOs from the mass media, from Hollywood movies and so on. It's quite funny to see that the UFO topic has been so serious that it was even dealt with at the United Nations. And I'm very happy that I have now the chance to speak to Lee Speigel. He's a producer, writer, reporter, and former host of NBC Radio's The Edge of Reality show. He's hosted nearly 1,500 programs on unexplained phenomena, and he previously worked at Westwood One Radio and ABC News. And he's currently with the Huffington Post, and he's the only person to have ever produced a presentation at the United Nations on the subject of UFOs. Welcome, Lee.
Well, how are you doing today, Rob?
Fine, thank you. So how did you first become involved in this whole story?
Well, a couple of years before the United Nations presentation, and we're going back now to 1975, I produced a documentary. Not a documentary for television, but on a recording, a vinyl record album, and it was called UFOs: The Credibility Factor. I did this for CBS, and it kind of became an instant classic because it was the first time that a major company like CBS had given the go-ahead and had committed to putting out a product about UFOs. It was also the first time that such a product was advertised on television in a 2-minute commercial. And it was also the first time that many voices of people came together to talk about the UFO encounters, military people, some government people, law enforcement. And the whole album came about because I had been reading about UFOs. There was a big UFO wave in the United States at the time, and I wanted to hear the voices of people involved, and I thought that the public wanted to hear this too. And so I put this album together, and we released it in the beginning of 1976, and then a year later, I started noticing that the country of Grenada was starting to make some waves at the United Nations. Its Prime Minister, Eric Gairy, had gone before the General Assembly and had tried to get the UN to pay attention to his interest in UFOs in his country of Grenada. And he wanted the United Nations to put some kind of a committee together that would study UFOs, share the information with other countries. And I thought this was very interesting. And I also noticed that the United Nations wasn't paying any attention to the guy. So I came up with an idea. I wanted, after doing the album in 1975 and releasing it in 76, I became restless. To me, it wasn't enough. I wanted to do something more to make people aware of UFOs. And I realized that you can't just walk in to the United Nations off the street and say, "Hello, may I do a United Nations UFO presentation, please?" Because you can't do that. You have to be part of a delegation of a country that wants to do this. So since Eric Gairy and Grenada were the only game in town, they were the only ones talking about UFOs, I sent a copy of my UFO album over to the Grenada mission, to their ambassadors, with a note saying, "Please give this album to your Prime Minister with my compliments. And I would love to be able to talk with him about an idea that I have about bringing UFOs to the United Nations." So I became friendly with his ambassadors and had many meetings with them, and they finally invited me to come to the United Nations on the night that Eric Gairy was knighted as Sir Eric Gairy, because they said he wanted to meet me. And so I went there that night. It was an amazing experience, and the Prime Minister and I had a private meeting. He told me how much he liked my album, and what could we do together. I said, well, Mr. Prime Minister, with all due respect, I can see that the United Nations isn't really paying a lot of attention to your crusade about UFOs. Now, as you know, all the people on my album are very credible people, and I have more credible people that I can bring to a presentation. If you would sponsor my presentation, I will bring all these people together that the United Nations will pay attention to. With all due respect, sir. and and so over a handshake, we made a deal, and I started getting checks from the country of Grenada to pay for the work that I needed to do to gather all the documents, all the materials, to pay for people's transportation to the United Nations, and we were off and running, and that's how it started.
So you started this whole campaign. When were the United Nations first informed about the fact that the Grenadian mission will introduce a resolution draft about this issue?
Well, he began to talk about it in 1977, I believe, and at the time he was drafting his resolution, and it may have nearly been completed by the time that we had done our handshake to agree to do a presentation together. But the way it works at the UN, they at some point during the year, the General Assembly and all the important committees, they take a vacation, they take a break, and then they reconvene in the fall of the year. So what we did was in July of 1978, we arranged to have a meeting during the summer at the United Nations with the Secretary General, Kurt Waldheim. And the purpose of that meeting was to let him know what our plan was in November when we were going to do the actual presentation. And so the Secretary General wanted to know, well, who's going to be there? What's the purpose of it? And I believe at that point is when Eric Gairy actually presented the resolution to the Secretary General and said, here is what we formally would like to do at the United Nations. And here are some of the people today who are going to help us with bringing it to the attention of the world body. And there were several pictures taken of all of us sitting around that table with the Secretary General, and at least one of those pictures has become pretty famous. It's been published many times around the world in books and magazines that show us there with astronaut Gordon Cooper, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, Dr. Jacques Vallée, the Secretary General, me, and that picture kind of let the public know that there was something coming up at the United Nations about UFOs for the first time.
What was the atmosphere during that meeting?
It was very cordial. I noticed that a couple of the scientists who were there seemed a little stiff, and maybe that's because many scientists are very stiff. I mean, that's a perception that the public has had about scientists and science. I think they were a little uncomfortable, maybe a little overwhelmed, because they were sitting among some pretty important people at the United Nations, and they couldn't believe that they were actually there. I was already working for NBC Radio at the time, or actually, no, I shouldn't say that, because that was in July of 1978. NBC hired me in October when they heard that I was putting the presentation together, and they thought, well, maybe we should hire this guy to come on the air and do UFO reports. So in July, I think I was so impressed with all the people that were sitting there at the table with me. And I remember just saying to myself, be cool, stay cool. This is a very amazing situation that you find yourself in. You know, like, don't don't look at the cameras. Don't don't slouch over in your seat. Don't do any weird bad habits because a lot of pictures are being taken. Just be here, be very good, and say what you want to say, and then get out of here as fast as you can.
So then you sat there and you took all the precautions, preparations. You informed the Secretary General of your plan, and how
Right.
do you think it was received from his part?
Well, from his part, like I said, I think that he was very cordial. I learned later that he had a personal interest in UFOs, but I didn't know to what extent that interest was, and frankly, I didn't care because all I knew was that I had been given the green light um, to go ahead and put this together, and so now it was my job to spend the rest of the time between July and November to get the presentation ready. That was all that I could focus on because I knew that the UN was basically expecting me to pull out a good show and to get it together. So I was just very focused I actually I never saw or spoke to the Secretary General again after that, and that was fine because I didn't need to.
Okay, so what exactly did you present at the United Nations?
Well, what we did was we had several speakers lined up, including astronomers J. Allen Hynek, Jacques Vallée, Army helicopter captain Larry Coyne, Stan Friedman, and we were originally going to have astronaut Gordon Cooper, who was with us at that July meeting, but there was a schedule conflict and he wasn't able to be at the United Nations with us in November. So what I did was I asked him if he would make a letter, to draw a letter that he would address to the ambassadors or to the Prime Minister of Grenada on his official letterhead. And I said, I want you to write a letter, and in this letter, I want you to talk about your personal beliefs about UFOs, your personal experiences seeing UFOs, and what you think the United Nations should do about investigating and studying UFOs. And so he wrote this letter. He sent the letter to me, and I made about 1 million copies of it because I had to take all of the materials that I had been gathering and submit them to the United Nations to have them translated into several languages. So I needed time to do all that. And then once he sent me the letter and I had everything translated, I then passed the original letter on to Grenada so they would have that in their files. And that letter from Gordon Cooper to the United Nations has been published many, many times in many documents and newspapers around the world since that time because he was the first astronaut to come out publicly like that to really voice his opinion about UFOs. So it was all right that he wasn't actually at the United Nations in November because his letter was, and that was important. And I mentioned one of the speakers at the UN was Army Captain Larry Coyne. The reason I wanted him there was because he was the pilot of an Army helicopter that was involved with an amazing UFO encounter in 1973. His story, when it came out, was one of the first stories that grabbed my attention about UFOs because after the encounter he had, the Army did not try and keep him quiet about it. They said, if you want to talk to the press, go ahead and talk to the press. We don't care. And he was in command of a 4-man helicopter crew flying over Ohio in the United States. And they saw this object coming at them from the horizon, and it was moving so fast, they thought it was going to collide with their helicopter. So all they could do was just sit there and assume that they were going to die. But instead of colliding with the helicopter, the object stopped, and it moved directly above the helicopter, and it shined a green light into their cockpit. Everything in the cockpit was bathed in a green glow. And as they sat there wondering what this was, they could look up and see that it was a giant cigar-shaped craft. It had no wings, no tail. It just looked like a giant cigar-shaped thing. And suddenly the helicopter was pulled up and it rose several thousand feet in a matter of seconds. This thing just pulled the helicopter up, and then there was a bump, and the helicopter was released by the UFO, and the UFO took off. Well, these guys landed. Several people on the ground also saw this happening. And when they landed, they went to headquarters and said, we're not going to keep quiet about this. We almost died up there. We're going to talk about this. So their story came out really fast, and it made headlines. And then I decided, well, I want this guy to come to the United Nations and tell his story. And he said he wanted to because he was one of the people on my UFO album that I put together in 1975. And he said, I would like to come to the UN and to be one of your speakers, but you're going to have to get permission from the Army to let me come to New York to do that. And so I called his superior officers in Ohio, and they said, well, we will allow Captain Coyne to come there on one condition. And I said, okay, what's the condition? They said, we don't want him to appear in his uniform. If you don't mind that, he can go there dressed in a civilian suit, but he can't go there in an official military capacity. And I said, is that it? Is that the condition? And they said, yes. And I said, you know what? I'll buy him a suit if I have to. I don't care what he wears. You got a deal. And so when you see pictures of him at the United Nations, that's why he's in a regular suit and not his uniform.
Okay. And you also had J. Allen Hynek, who at that time was not active for the United States Air Force anymore. Is that correct?
That's right. J. Allen Hynek used to be the official scientific consultant to the Air Force to the Project Blue Book. He basically was the man that the Air Force would send all around the country when there were big UFO sightings. And his job was essentially to explain it all away, debunk it, and just make it go away.
So how did you manage to convince him to take part in this pro-UFO initiative at the United Nations?
Oh, it was easy. He was one of my main speakers on my UFO album, again, 1975. This is why that album to me is so important. It was, you hear this word disclosure that people are always using now about UFOs. It's time for disclosure. People are now disclosing their information. Well, we didn't use that word disclosure back in the 1970s, but basically that's what I was doing. I was disclosing information about UFOs first on my album and then at the United Nations. So Hynek and I became friends in 1975 when he was one of the first scientists to put his voice on my album. And so the album was out there. It did very well. He was very impressed with it. So then the following year, when I started thinking about the United Nations, he was the first person I called, and I said, look, I've got this idea. I want to do this thing at the United Nations. Do you want to do it with me? And he said, absolutely. And he wrote me a letter that you can see on my website, leespeigel.com, where his letter basically says, I want to be there at the United Nations with you. Here's why I think it's important that we do something on an international scale. I've always wanted to bring it to the United Nations. Let me know what I can do to help you. And that's how he got involved with it.
Okay, so you had all these famous people. You had Jacques Vallée and Claude Poher from France. I don't know if the French already had their civilian UFO investigation department at that time, or
well, they had it was actually an official department called GEPAN, and the head of GEPAN was astronomer Claude Poher. And because he was friendly with Dr. Hynek, Hynek brought him to America to be part of that July meeting that we had with the Secretary General in 1978. And if you look at that famous picture of all of us there, you see Poher sitting next to Dr. Hynek. And so Poher, it was great to meet him because I was not aware of who he was until Dr. Hynek said to me, would you mind if we bring Dr. Poher in from France because he's in charge of their official government UFO office? And I said, of course, absolutely, bring him in. And so that's how France became involved with the project.
And obviously, the meeting that you had back in July of 1978 with the Secretary General stirred a lot of attention, as we learned from British government documents released back in March 2011.
Amazing! I have to tell you, I was working for AOL News, the Huffington Post last year when those documents were released. And so that was like 33 years after my UN presentation, all right? So my editor said to me, these new documents have been released by the British government. Why don't you do a story about it? And I said, all right, fine. It might be a good story. And I started looking at the documents, and the first story that I read about them was written by the BBC in England, because I think they were among the first media companies to actually get those documents. So I wanted to see what they wrote about the documents, and I'm reading the story, and it says, among the documents just released by our British government are some key documents that talk about how Great Britain tried to stop a 1977 and 78 presentation at the United Nations on UFOs. And I went, what? What did I just read? Great Britain tried to stop what? And I went back and I read it over again. And I went, wait a minute, that was my presentation. England tried to prevent my presentation? Wait a minute, something's wrong here. So I said, why am I learning about this now, 33 years later? So I went back to my editor and I said, look, this story that you wanted me to write about the documents, it has now become personal because now it's involving something that I did 33 years ago. Can I turn the story around and make it a more personal story? Because I want to find out what this is all about. He said, yeah, sure, go do it. So the first thing I did was I picked up the phone and I called Nick Pope in London. Nick, for 3 years, was the head of the British government UFO office at the Ministry of Defense. He did this between 1991 and 1994. And I also knew that because of his involvement with the British government, when Great Britain released new documents about UFOs, they always gave him the documents first so he could go over them as a courtesy to him before they released them to the public. So I wanted to talk to Nick and see what he knew about these documents about my presentation. So I called him up. The first thing he said to me was, I've been expecting your call. I said, oh, really? You've been expecting my call. Okay, tell me about your country and my UN presentation. He said, well, apparently Great Britain at the time in 1978 felt that it would not be a good idea for the United Nations to do anything about UFOs, especially to acknowledge that UFOs even exist, because they felt that the United Nations would fall into disrepute, that people would no longer think of the United Nations as a credible entity. I went, well, so they're going to pick on me? They decided to stop my presentation? There could have been any other things that they could have done that could cause them non-credibility in the world. Why do they have to choose UFOs? He said, because this is a very touchy subject matter. Part of what happened when Nick was with the Ministry of Defense, he told me exclusively, and I wrote a separate story about this, it was part of his job to debunk UFOs. They called it spin and dirty tricks that they played on the public and the media. And I said, well, what does that mean? He said, I was told to draft press memos and information that we gave to the press and to the public where we downplayed UFOs and we tried to make all UFOs go away. And I said, well, why did you do that? Why did the British government want to do that? He said, because we were concerned that we didn't want the public to know that there were actually things operating in our skies that we had no control over. So we had to quiet it as much as we could. And I went, wow, that's amazing.
And excuse me, and it seems that the United Nations or the permanent missions to the United Nations at that time, back in 1978, were also afraid that this subject would eventually become a serious subject, and they tried to, according to the British government documents here, I'm quoting from a telegram from November 24th, 1978, where the United Nations, the British permanent mission is instructed to oppose the resolution draft by Grenada and to try to convince Grenada to let go of that idea to establish a UN body to investigate UFOs. And here it says, the idea is to let Mr. Gairy have his day, waiting until he has left New York before attempting to negotiate a compromise with the Grenada mission, which will ideally require minimal or even no UN involvement and no additional UN expenditure. Various ideas are beginning to be discussed in the corridors. We may be able to report after Monday's meeting, which look worth considering. How do you feel when you read those lines?
It's amazing, Rob, and you're absolutely right. That you said that memo was written on November 24th. That was 3 days before my presentation, and it's amazing to me now that I was just learning about this, as I said, 33 years after it all went down. Listen. On the one hand, I can understand why many countries didn't and probably still don't want to talk about UFOs. There are many reasons for that. There are not a lot of leaders of countries who would like to give up what they call their power over their citizens. They don't want the public to know that there's maybe new sources of energy that we could use based on UFO technology, because what would happen to all the companies that rely on like the oil industry, for example, for energy. There are many repercussions, even today, of why countries should want to keep quiet about UFOs. But it's hard for them to do because more and more people now are seeing these things in the sky because of all the iPhone cameras and the digital cameras, and people are always holding cameras now. One of the problems with that, of course, is that you can also fake a lot of stuff too on the internet. But so I understand why the United Nations, why many of the countries wanted to keep it quiet. In the end, it was mostly the Soviet Union and the United States that passed the veto to try and get other countries to back down. And coincidentally, was it a coincidence? A few months later, at the beginning of 1979, suddenly Sir Eric Gairy was overthrown in a political coup in his country, and when that happened and he was no longer in power, suddenly the UFO resolution quietly went away because no other country wanted to pick up on it.
Now, what's amazing is that in those British government files from September '78, you can also see how they try to convince the Grenadian mission to give up their proposal of the establishment of the UN body and to try to easen it up, to lower costs for UN expenditure. And And this is actually the first document where I ever found any involvement of a German, of the Germans in this United Nations resolution. Here it says, the Germans with Austrian backing favor a group of experts to be appointed by the government of Grenada, which might in due course report its findings to the Secretary General. And that is when I started to do my investigation and looked at the political archives of the German Federal Foreign Office. And I found the documents, as I've told you.
Yeah.
What's really interesting about the documents is one of them, it's a telegram from November 28th, 1978. It specifically addresses the presentation that you had. I'm not sure if I translated it correctly, but I will do my best. It says, Grenada's permanent mission has presented a resolution draft on UFOs at the Special Political Committee, which proposes the establishment of an expert group, which is supposed to define the framework for UN studies about the UFO phenomenon under the supervision of the Outer Space Committee. Now, the German permanent mission says in this telegram, quite apart from the wider implications of such resolution draft, the reference to the Outer Space Committee alone has its misgivings, as it would incur Grenada's desire to become a member of the Outer Space Committee, which would therefore be constantly occupied with the UFO questions. So you see, the Germans, they were actually concerned that the UFO subject would be discussed constantly on a regular basis, that it has this committee. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and as you were reading that, I was thinking I can hear all the skeptics right now, the UFO skeptics, applauding the Germans and saying, "Yes, we don't want to talk about UFOs because there's nothing to it." Well, there is something to it, and I think that another factor that people forget is when it comes to the subject of UFOs, not only did a lot of the governments not want to have to explain to their people what some of these things were that were flying around in their skies. Can you think of any government on the planet whose military leaders want to share information that they have about UFOs? Nobody wants to share the information. Everybody wants to get their hands on their own UFO and try and figure out how they work. Nick Pope told me that after Nick got the job at the Ministry of Defense, one day one of his superior officers came in and apparently took the poster down off the wall, and Nick never saw the picture again. And in fact, last year when the British government released some previously classified documents, they released the story of that UFO picture, but instead of any picture, all that you could see was a little hand drawing of what the diamond-shaped UFO looked like. And Nick said basically the thinking was, since this was considered a real unknown object by the British government, and we didn't have one of these in our own inventory, we wanted it. We wanted something like this to figure out how it worked. Well, that was the thinking, and probably still is among many countries. Everybody wants to get a UFO. Everybody wants the technology to have superior technology. And so there have been many claims, especially by the conspiracy theorists, that the United States has captured UFOs, maybe from Roswell, New Mexico in 1947, that other countries have captured UFOs, and they're trying to figure out how the technology works. My question is, and I'm always asking this, if so many UFOs have been crashing in different countries around the world, what does this say about their technology? Why are they crashing? What's wrong with them?
Yeah, I would never make a step into a UFO because they crash all the time.
It's like, anyway, you guys, if you guys are getting here from another planet or another solar system, why are you crashing on our planet?
Yeah.
What's the problem?
Yeah. Now, from reading the German government files I just found, it seems to me that the Grenadian resolution draft had to be avoided by the other delegations because they thought that it it would cost a lot of money at the United Nations. At that time, they were really concerned with the cost, and they had so many new tasks. I think the Outer Space Committee had just been set up, and they just wanted, to avoid costs. And no, let me just quote. Let me just give you another quote from the German government files. It says here in a report from September 6, 1978. So that's shortly after your first presentation with the Secretary General. Now this quote shows how they already prepared this resolution to be a dead end. Okay, so it says, last year the other delegations had been in the awkward situation or position to gracefully decline Grenada's request in order to avoid embarrassment for the United Nations. If Grenada still doesn't understand that, and at least in part their action is aimed at gaining publicity, their item will probably be treated with much less scrutiny at the 33rd General Assembly and procedurally killed. That's, I don't know if I translated that correctly. So killed in procedure. And the next sentence explains what they mean with this. They say, obviously to this effect, the General Secretary Waldheim has already suggested the establishment of an ad hoc committee in which only voluntary delegations become active.
Yes, exactly. I mean, even Waldheim, maybe because of his own personal interest in UFOs, he was keeping the door open for any countries who still wanted to voluntarily participate in something, to share information. We knew from the very beginning that the translation problems alone were going to be huge, because there are only 3 or 4 basic languages used at the United Nations. So there would have been some costs, of course, to have somebody translate things and to share them. But when you talk about there'll be too many costs, no, I don't go along with that. Almost every day the United Nations is putting some new committee together. All that we were trying to do was to create a very small committee, and like you said, an ad hoc committee. We were looking to get 3 people, 3 representatives. I even was volunteering to be one of those people. Just a few people who would sit there in a little office maybe and start getting information from countries around the world who wanted to share information. That's all that we were doing. That would not have cost a lot of money, wouldn't have involved a lot of man hours. I'm sure that the United Nations wastes a lot more money than we were asking them to supply for this kind of a venture. No, the bottom line was that the bigger countries like the United States and the Soviet Union didn't want any attention put onto UFOs. They had to stop it at all costs. And that's what happened. And so they basically embarrassed. It wasn't Grenada who was embarrassed. It was Great Britain. It was maybe Germany who were embarrassed to the point, or intimidated, might be a better word. They basically said, you people should kind of get on board with the United States and the Soviet Union, because if we don't want anything coming out about UFOs, then you don't either. Pay attention to our lead and everything will be fine. And I'm sure that those were the kind of discussions that happened. That's the only thing that makes sense. And like I said, was it just a coincidence that Sir Eric Gairy's entire political future, went away when his political structure was overthrown just a few months after our presentation at the United Nations? Boy, talk about your base. Well, that's just a question that I raised. I can't prove that. I'm not even going to try and prove it. But it was a big coincidence, I thought.
Yeah. So can you describe me how was Prime Minister Sir Eric Gairy as a person? How was he? What was your impression of him?
He was I found him to be a very arrogant man. I found that once he wanted to talk about something, he didn't really want to let anybody else have any other say in the matter. And this was something that became apparent to me and to some of my other speakers on the day of the presentation. There were two separate meetings on that day on November 27th. There was a morning session and an afternoon session. And in between both sessions, we had a press conference. And again, there are a couple of pictures that have been taken and that have gone around the world that show us sitting at the press conference. And the only person you see talking is Sir Eric Gairy. And he started talking about things that almost had nothing to do with UFOs. He was doing some political grandstanding, if you will. And there's one picture especially where I'm probably the only one who notices this, but you can almost see the look in my eye when I'm looking directly at the Prime Minister, and I'm thinking, okay, it's time for you to be quiet and let some of these other guys talk. But he didn't want to. He took over the press conference, and I was not happy about that at the time.
And you can even see it somehow, the face of J. Allen Hynek, who's hiding behind his pipe, right?
Yes, I know. That's exactly right. And I remember Hynek and I, we talked about that many times after that. He kept saying, well, why did he bring us here? You know, if he didn't want us to talk, you know, it's not enough for us to talk in front of the committee, but if we're going to talk in front of the press, well, that's important too. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It became a little bit of a circus, and that didn't help the credibility either of everything that I was trying to do there.
Now, at that time, back in 1978, there were, like one would say, almost kind of fractions of all the between the delegations. There were the Group of the Nine, for example, the Group of the Unbound States, and the Communist Bloc and all that. And Grenada didn't actually belong to any of those groups. Maybe the Unbound States. At least not. It was not a delegation that anybody took very seriously, right?
Well, and that's the reason why, it's one of the reasons why I approached Grenada in the first place, was because they were just a little tiny Caribbean country, didn't really belong or wasn't part of like another group, as you say, and yet, but they were the only country that was talking about UFOs, and for my purposes, I needed to be part of a country in order to get my presentation done. I mean, what was I going to do? Was I going to go to the United States mission, or go to Washington and march into the White House and say, "Will you let me produce a presentation for our country?" Well, no, that was not going to happen. I needed to be part of a delegation that would allow me to do it and to give me a free hand at it too. And for a while, Grenada let me do what I wanted to. I didn't know that Eric Gairy was going to try and take over the press conference when he did. I had no idea. All that I knew was that he gave me the green light to go ahead and put together the presentation, to bring the speakers that I wanted to bring. And in fact, Rob, most of the people who were there, like Alan Hynek, Jacques Vallée, even the Army Captain Coyne, none of them actually said that they thought that UFOs were technology from another planet. The only person who did that in the afternoon session was nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman, but he's always said that. And that's what he does. That's what he lectures on. But the other guys, they wanted to keep it as straightforward and neutral as possible. All that they wanted to get across was, there's something going on all around the planet. We should study it. And
what about the Prime Minister, Eric Gairy himself? What did he tell you?
He claimed that he had more than one encounter in his country, that many people had seen UFOs in Grenada. And I think maybe part of what he wanted to do was to get more tourism dollars to come into his country. I understand that. That's part of what every country wants. They want to raise money. They want to bring tourists in. It's the economy. Fine. I understand that. And I didn't mind that. All that I knew was here was a country that was going to let me put something together at the United Nations that had never been done before, and as long as they stay off my back and give me enough money to do what I needed to do, that's what I'm looking for, because the credibility alone of the people that I would bring there should make a difference. And even to this day, Jacques Vallée told me recently, even though we didn't get what we originally set out to do at the UN, that the event itself was a milestone in the field of UFOs. And people still say that, and I'm very proud of that. I'm proud that I was part of it and that we were able to pull it together. No one has done it since then, but now there's more of a movement to go back to the United Nations and try it again, using the same resolution, in fact.
Yeah, so when are you going to go back, and which country are you going to choose? The Seychelles Islands, or?
Yeah, I'm going back this afternoon, actually. No, about a month ago, I was down in Arizona at the International UFO Congress that they have there every year, and I was honored when they named me their UFO Researcher of the Year. That was quite an honor for me. But among the people that I met there was the retired General Ricardo Bermudez from Chile. The general is in charge of the Chilean government official UFO office, and he very seriously wants to unite with some other countries and try and bring this whole idea back to the United Nations using the same words that we had in our original resolution from 1978, because all that stuff still works. I mean, it would still be nice to get the same kind of committee together to get countries sharing information. So the resolution, nobody has to rewrite the resolution. We just use the same old one and see if there's a different climate now at the United Nations for talking about this, because UFOs haven't gone away. They're not going away. The only problem is that now there are too many more hoaxes now that are coming up on YouTube and on the internet. It's so impossible now to determine which ones are real, which ones aren't.
So where do you think we would be now if that United Nations department had been established at that time? I mean, if Grenada would have been successful, where do you think ufology, UFO research would have landed? Where would we be now?
That's a really good question, and you know, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think anyone has asked me that in all these years, and so to try and give you a thoughtful answer, I think that if the agency had been created, and if a new attitude had come out of that, an attitude of sharing, international cooperation, because what does the United Nations, what do all the nations actually share and cooperate on now? It's mostly, how do we avoid killing each other? How do we avoid getting involved with wars? How do we deal with famine and the problems of the economy? Nobody seems to, on the surface, want to talk about UFOs, and yet, knowing what I know now about how the United States has learned about UFOs in other countries, I know that they're still very interested in it, but they want to keep downplaying it. I think that had the committee been formulated in an era of international cooperation, it's entirely possible that by now there would have been some international contact made with whoever the visitors are, because I believe that we're being visited. I don't know who we're being visited by. I don't know where they come from. I don't care. Frankly, I just don't care. With all the planets that are being discovered now, we now know hundreds and hundreds of planets. And now we find that more planets are being discovered by the Kepler spacecraft that could be habitable planets. And scientists now think that there could be millions or billions of planets just in our little galaxy. that could have intelligent life. So I'm one of those who believe that we're not alone. So I don't care where the visitors come from. I know that I'm convinced that they're here, and I think that we would have been welcomed into their galactic neighborhood by now if our committee had gone through in 1978. It would have been such an amazing thing, Rob, in terms of international cooperation and on such a subject. Even the Vatican, a couple of years ago, one of the Vatican astronomers offered to baptize any aliens who might want to be baptized. Well, that's a little arrogant. I mean, you know, a spaceship comes down in the Vatican and you go up to them and you say, would you like us to baptize you? I mean, what religion are you on your planet? But the Vatican has actually said and come out that they would not be against the idea that we have brothers and sisters who live somewhere else. They say it would just expand God's universe instead of diminishing it. And I like that. You know, we are part of a galactic neighborhood. Let's all play together, I say.
And I think the ex-president Ronald Reagan said something similar to that effect, also in front of the United Nations, right? He said,
"Yeah, He in one of his speeches, he had been talking about how the world needs to come together. I don't know the exact wording, but
how all the local little differences would disappear if an alien species would make contact or something."
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think I think that was a couple of years after your, I'm not sure exactly when it was, somewhere in the 80s. Do you think he made another try to approach this subject, or was it just for
well,
for
I'm not sure. You know, Ronald Reagan once said that he saw a UFO outside of his plane. Jimmy Carter filed an actual official UFO report. Bill Clinton, when he was president, tried to get information about UFOs. Gerald Ford, when he was still a congressman, tried to get a congressional investigation about UFOs. So this is not anything new that presidents have been interested in UFOs, but in the last few administrations, we don't seem to have somebody who feels that way, or who at least thinks that it's important enough to pursue it, which is weird because you'd think that a president would want to at least go along with the will or the desires of the majority of the people, and it is the majority of Americans who believe that UFOs are real and are from someplace else.
Okay, so so all we can do is hope that the whole subject will be started all over again. Maybe in front of the United Nations. Maybe with the help of Chile. Are you already in touch with him, discussing things, or?
Yeah, well, I've been in touch with the general. In fact, when we met, we were both speakers at the UFO Congress in Arizona, and he and I had a chance to have a private meeting because I wanted to do an interview with him so that I would have his thoughts on tape, and he would like to work with me, and basically he would like to work with anybody who is serious enough to want to get this information out. One of the things, in fact, my new story that's up right now on the Huffington Post is about an airline pilot who had an encounter, a very close encounter, almost 40 years ago, but he didn't tell anybody about it for almost 40 years. And he gave me an exclusive story about the encounter, and he filed a report last year with Dr. Richard Haynes. Richard Haynes is a former NASA research scientist, and he's in charge of a national, actually an international organization called NARCAP, where he deals specifically with airline and commercial and private pilots who want to come forward and talk about their UFO sightings. And his concern is that he wants to make flying more safe for the flying public, because there is the potential, a safety issue. So many pilots have reported UFOs coming close to their aircraft, and the pilots didn't know how to respond. But Dr. Haynes says that the airline industry, they don't want to hear this. They don't want to go public and acknowledge that there are UFOs because that would not be good for business if the public felt that flying was potentially dangerous. So there are a lot of issues about UFOs and the reporting of UFOs that people just aren't aware of. It's bigger than most people think.
And there's still a long way to go, right?
Oh yes, and
Yeah.
I hope that in my lifetime, in your lifetime, in everybody's lifetime, that we live to the day where we see some kind of acceptance of UFOs and some kind of formal contact. I mean, I want Star Trek to happen.
Yeah, me too. And I think we could definitely need some help from our little gray friends, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much, Lee, for taking the time for this interview and for showing us the background of this whole amazing story that took place back in December 1978. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rob.
And good luck for your future actions on this. I hope you will keep me up to date, and I hope we will hear all about Chile's United Nations approach whenever it comes up.
I hope so too. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.